You sit down to work and it hits you like a wall. That familiar tension in your chest. The mental static. The voice that whispers, "This isn't good enough." Before you've even started, you've tried everything: breathing exercises, meditation apps, positive thinking. They help for a moment, but the anxiety always comes back stronger. Here's what nobody told you. You're fighting the wrong battle. Anxiety isn't your enemy trying to destroy you. It's your own mind trying to protect you, but it's using 200,000-year-old software in a modern world. What if instead of fighting anxiety, you learn to listen to what it's actually trying to tell you? What if your greatest weakness could become your most reliable strength? I spent years drowning in anxiety that killed my productivity and focus. Then I discovered something that changed everything. Before we dive into the audiobook, subscribe to Darkwood Audiobooks so you stay on track with our mission. Listen, learn, level up. You cannot defeat an enemy you refuse to understand. You wake up, and it's already there. That familiar weight in your chest, the static in your mind, the sense that something is wrong, even when nothing is actually happening. You've been fighting this thing for so long, you've forgotten what peace feels like. Maybe it started small, a little worry about a presentation, some tension before a date, normal stuff. But somewhere along the way it grew teeth. Now it's everywhere, in your work, your relationships, your sleep. It's the voice that whispers you're not ready when opportunity knocks. It's the paralysis that hits when you try to focus. It's the reason you scroll your phone instead of building something meaningful. You've declared war on anxiety, and you're losing. Let me tell you something that might hurt to hear. You're losing because you're fighting the wrong battle. Every breathing exercise, every positive affirmation, every attempt to calm down is like trying to negotiate with a smoke alarm while your house burns down. You're treating the symptom while the real fire rages on. I know because I fought this war for years. Crippling anxiety that made focus impossible. Couldn't start projects without my brain screaming disaster scenarios. Couldn't make decisions without analyzing every possible way things could go wrong. Productivity? Forget it. I was spending more energy fighting my own mind than actually getting anything done. The meditation apps helped for about 20 minutes. Therapy gave me coping mechanisms. Medication took the edge off, but nothing actually solved it, because I was trying to defeat something I didn't understand. Here's what changed everything. Anxiety isn't random chaos. It's not a chemical imbalance or a character flaw or evidence that you're weak. Anxiety is communication. Terrible, primitive, brutal communicating. Your brain is a paranoid bodyguard protecting you from dangers that don't exist. Your brain is running software that's about 200,000 years out of date. Picture our ancestors on the African savanna. A rustle in the bushes could mean dinner or death. The humans who survived were the ones whose brains erred on the side of caution. Better to run from a harmless sound than ignore a real predator. That hyper-vigilant alarm system kept us alive long enough to build civilization, but now it's killing our ability to function in that civilization. Your anxiety isn't malfunctioning, it's working exactly as designed, for a world that no longer exists. Every morning your ancient brain scans for threats, but instead of saber-toothed tigers, it finds performance, reviews, social media notifications, and unread emails. Instead of physical predators, it identifies psychological dangers, rejection, failure, embarrassment, inadequacy, and it responds to all of them the same way. Flood the system with stress hormones and prepare for immediate action. The problem isn't that your brain creates anxiety. The problem is that it creates anxiety for imaginary threats that feel completely real. Let me show you how this plays out in daily life. You sit down to work on something important. Immediately your brain starts generating disaster scenarios. What if this isn't good enough? What if people realize I'm not qualified? What if I fail and everyone sees? These aren't rational assessments of risk. They're your threat detection system misfiring. Your brain has identified doing important work as dangerous because it might lead to judgment or failure. So it creates anxiety to stop you from taking that risk. The same thing happens with decisions. Your brain presents you with elaborate catastrophes. Choose wrong and your career is over. Pick the wrong option and you'll regret it forever. So instead of deciding, you research endlessly, seeking perfect information that doesn't exist. Or relationships. Your brain whispers, say the wrong thing and they'll reject you. Show too much interest and you'll look desperate. Be yourself and they'll discover you're not worth their time. In every case, your brain is trying to protect you from psychological pain by preventing you from taking psychological risks. It would rather keep you safe and small than risk you being hurt and exposed. But here's the cruel irony. By protecting you from imaginary threats, your anxiety creates real problems. You miss opportunities because you're too paralyzed to act. You stay stuck because moving forward feels too dangerous. You underperform because you're fighting your own mind instead of focusing on the task. Your false threat system doesn't just create anxiety about big things, it creates anxiety about tiny things too, because it can't calibrate risk properly. Sending an email becomes a threat. What if they think I'm bothering them? Asking a question becomes a threat. What if they realize I don't know something I should know? Starting a conversation becomes a threat. What if they don't want to talk to me? Your brain treats all potential social rejection as life-threatening, even though none of it actually threatens your survival. This is why traditional anxiety advice often fails. When someone tells you to just relax or don't worry about it, they're asking you to override a system that believes your life is in danger. Your brain doesn't relax when it thinks you're about to be eaten by a tiger. But once you understand that your brain is responding to false alarms, you can start to question those alarms instead of automatically believing them. When anxiety hits, instead of asking, how do I make this stop? Try asking, what threat is my brain trying to protect me from? Usually, you'll discover it's something like fear of being judged as incompetent, fear of failing and confirming you're not good enough, fear of succeeding and creating expectations you can't meet, fear of being rejected or abandoned, fear of being exposed as a fraud. None of these are actual threats to your survival. They're threats to your ego, your identity, your sense of who you think you are. Your brain can't tell the difference between physical death and psychological discomfort, so it responds to both with the same emergency protocols. But you can learn to tell the difference. You can learn to recognize when your alarm system is protecting you from paper tigers instead of real dangers. This doesn't mean ignoring all anxiety. Some anxiety is legitimate. If you're walking alone at night in a dangerous area, pay attention. But most anxiety in modern life is your Stone Age brain misinterpreting 21st century situations. The goal isn't to silence your threat detection system. The goal is to upgrade it. To teach it the difference between this might be uncomfortable and this will actually harm me. When you can make that distinction, anxiety stops controlling your life. Instead of being paralyzed by false alarms, you become selective about which signals deserve your attention. You stop running from every shadow and start moving toward what matters. Anxiety is not fear of failure. It's fear of who you might become if you fail. Strip away all the surface explanations, and anxiety comes down to one thing: identity protection. Every anxious moment is your psyche defending a version of yourself that might be under threat. This isn't about what might happen to you. It's about who you might turn out to be. Think about the last time you felt real anxiety about something important. Was it actually about the task itself? Or was it about what completion or failure of that task would mean about you as a person? When you're anxious about a presentation, you're not really worried about speaking for 30 minutes. You're worried that poor performance will prove you're not as competent as people think. When you're anxious about asking someone out, you're not really worried about hearing no. You're worried that rejection will confirm you're not attractive or interesting enough. When you're anxious about starting a business, you're not really worried about the work involved. You're worried that failure will expose you as someone who dreams big but can't execute. Your anxiety is always protecting some version of your identity. I'm smart, I'm capable, I'm worthy of respect. I'm good enough. The moment that identity feels threatened, your brain hits the panic button. This is why anxiety often hits hardest when you're about to do something important. Important tasks carry the highest risk of revealing something you don't want to know about yourself. Their identity. Stress tests. Let me give you a personal example. For years, I couldn't start writing projects without overwhelming anxiety. I told myself it was perfectionism or fear of failure, but that wasn't it. The real fear was simpler and more brutal. What if I write something and it's not good? What if I'm not actually a good writer? What if I've been lying to myself about having talent? As long as I didn't write, I could maintain the possibility that I was a good writer who just hadn't proven it yet. But actually writing meant risking the discovery that I wasn't good enough. So my brain created anxiety to protect the identity of potentially good writer by preventing me from becoming definitely mediocre writer. This is the hidden logic behind most anxiety. Better to stay in comfortable uncertainty than risk uncomfortable truth. Your brain would rather keep you wondering if you're good enough than let you find out you're not. But here's what I discovered. The identities anxiety protects are usually fragile because they're incomplete. I'm smart is fragile because it can't handle evidence of not knowing something. I'm capable is fragile because it can't survive failure. I'm worthy of respect is fragile because it depends on other people's opinions. These identities are brittle because they're based on outcomes rather than processes. They require you to be perfect to maintain them. But what if you built stronger identities that could handle imperfection? Instead of, I'm smart, try, I'm someone who learns. Instead of, I'm capable, try, I'm someone who figures things out. Instead of, I'm worthy of respect, try, I'm someone who respects himself. These process-based identities don't crumble when you encounter failure, ignorance, or rejection. They incorporate those experiences as data rather than threats. When your identity becomes, I'm someone who learns from everything, failure stops being a threat to who you are. It becomes information about what to try next. When your identity becomes, I'm someone who grows through challenges, difficulty stops being evidence of inadequacy. It becomes proof that you're pushing yourself. The anxiety doesn't disappear immediately, but it changes character. Instead of desperate protection of a fragile self-image, it becomes useful information about what growth edge you're approaching. Most men never examine the identities their anxiety is protecting. They just feel the emotional alarm and assume something external is threatening them. But the threat is almost always internal, fear of discovering something unwanted about themselves. Once you identify what version of yourself anxiety is defending, you can consciously choose whether that version is worth defending. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the version of yourself that anxiety protects is too small, too fragile, too dependent on external validation. Sometimes anxiety is protecting a self-image that's actually holding you back. In those moments, anxiety becomes useful information about what identity needs upgrading. The goal isn't to eliminate identity protection. The goal is to build identities robust enough that they don't need constant protection. Build an identity that gains strength from challenges rather than being threatened by them. Build an identity that uses failure as fuel rather than evidence of inadequacy. When your sense of self becomes unbreakable, anxiety stops being about protection and becomes about navigation. What you resist persists. What you understand transforms. For years, I treated anxiety like an intruder that needed to be expelled. Every time it showed up, I fought it. Breathing exercises to calm it down, positive thinking to argue with it, distraction to ignore it, medication to numb it. But fighting anxiety is like fighting your own shadow. The harder you struggle, the more exhausted you become, and the shadow never disappears. Everything changed when I stopped fighting and started listening. Not listening to believe what anxiety was telling me, not listening to agree with its catastrophic predictions, but listening to understand what it was trying to communicate about my internal state. Anxiety, I realized, is crude communication from a part of your brain that doesn't speak sophisticated language. It can't say, "I notice you're attempting something that might threaten your self-image, and I'm concerned about the psychological consequences." Instead, it floods you with physical sensations and disaster fantasies. It speaks in the language of emergency because that's the only language it knows. But once you learn to translate that emergency language into useful information, anxiety becomes a diagnostic tool rather than a destructive force. Here's how the translation works. When anxiety hits, instead of immediately trying to make it go away, pause and ask, what identity is this trying to protect? Not, what am I worried about? That question keeps you focused on external circumstances. Ask instead, what am I afraid this situation will reveal about me? The answer is usually one of a few core fears. I'm not as competent as people think. I'm not worthy of success or love. I'm weak and can't handle difficulty. I'm a fraud who will eventually be exposed. I'm not enough, and everyone will discover this. Once you identify the identity fear, the anxiety makes perfect sense. Your brain isn't malfunctioning. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, protecting you from threats to your sense of self. But now you can address the actual fear instead of just managing the symptoms. Let me walk you through a real example from my own experience. I was working on an important project, something that could significantly advance my career if it went well, or damage my reputation if it went poorly. Every time I sat down to work on it, anxiety would hit like a physical wave. My chest would tighten, my thoughts would scatter, and I'd find myself procrastinating instead of making progress. For weeks, I tried to push through the anxiety. I'd force myself to sit at the desk and try to work while fighting the internal storm. The result was hours of unproductive struggle and a project that barely advanced. Then I tried a different approach. When the anxiety hit, instead of fighting it, I asked, what identity is this trying to protect? The answer came immediately. I'm afraid this project will prove I'm not as talented as I think I am. I'm afraid that if I give my best effort and it's still not good enough, I'll have to face the fact that I'm mediocre. Suddenly, the anxiety made complete sense. My brain wasn't responding to the project itself. It was responding to the identity threat the project represented. As long as I didn't complete it, I could maintain the possibility that I was talented but just hadn't proven it yet. But completing it meant risking the discovery that my talent was limited. With this understanding, I could address the real issue. Instead of trying to calm the anxiety, I examined the identity it was protecting. I'm talented. That identity was fragile because it couldn't handle evidence of limitation. It required me to be exceptional to maintain it. So I consciously upgraded it. I'm someone who develops skill through practice. This new identity didn't require me to be naturally gifted. It allowed for mediocre first attempts, failed experiments, and gradual improvement. It was robust enough to handle whatever the project revealed about my current ability level. The moment I made this shift, the anxiety around the project dissolved. Not because the stakes were lower, but because my identity was no longer threatened by imperfect performance. I could work on the project with focus and energy because I wasn't simultaneously protecting a fragile self-image. This process, pausing when anxiety hits, identifying the identity being protected, and consciously upgrading that identity, became my standard approach to anxious moments. When I felt anxiety about a conversation, I'd ask what identity was threatened. Usually, I'm likable, or I'm socially competent. I'd upgrade to, I'm someone who connects authentically with people, or I'm someone who learns from social interactions. When I felt anxiety about a decision, I'd identify the threatened identity. I make good choices, or I don't make mistakes. I'd upgrade to, I'm someone who learns from every outcome, or I'm someone who adapts when new information becomes available. The pattern was always the same. Anxiety was protecting some version of myself that was too rigid to handle uncertainty or imperfection. By upgrading to a more flexible identity, the protection became unnecessary. Listening to anxiety this way transforms it from enemy to advisor. Instead of a force that paralyzes you, it becomes information about what internal work needs to be done. The storm doesn't disappear, but you learn to hear the signal within it. And once you can hear the signal, you can respond to what your mind actually needs instead of just reacting to what it fears. Your anxiety speaks in disasters, but means something simpler. Anxiety is a terrible communicator. When it wants to say, "I'm concerned you might feel embarrassed," it screams, "Everyone will laugh at you and your life will be ruined." When it means, "I'm worried you might feel rejected," it shrieks, "You'll die alone and unloved." When it's trying to express, "I'm afraid you might feel incompetent," it broadcasts, "You're a fraud and everyone will discover it." This is why anxiety feels so overwhelming. It doesn't speak in measured, rational language. It speaks in absolute catastrophes, ultimate disasters, total annihilation. But once you understand that anxiety is emotionally dysregulated translation, you can decode what it's actually trying to tell you. The catastrophic language is just packaging. The actual message is usually much simpler. Here's how to translate the most common anxiety scripts. What if I fail and everyone sees how incompetent I am? Translation: I'm afraid of feeling incompetent. What if they reject me and I end up completely alone? Translation: I'm afraid of feeling rejected. What if I make the wrong choice and ruin my entire future? Translation: I'm afraid of feeling regret. What if they discover I don't know what I'm doing? Translation: I'm afraid of feeling exposed. What if I succeed and then can't live up to the expectations? Translation: I'm afraid of feeling inadequate to future demands. Notice the pattern. Anxiety always translates simple emotional fears into complex external disasters. It takes "I might feel bad" and turns it into "everything will be destroyed forever." This dramatic inflation makes anxiety seem much more serious than it actually is. Your brain presents you with vivid scenarios of total failure, permanent rejection, and irreversible damage. But when you strip away the theatrical language, you're usually just afraid of experiencing temporary discomfort. Most anxiety is fear of feeling something you don't want to feel. The irony is that by creating dramatic scenarios to avoid potential discomfort, anxiety guarantees actual discomfort. You end up feeling anxious about the possibility of feeling bad, which means you feel bad, regardless of what happens. Understanding this helps you respond to anxiety more effectively. Instead of getting caught up in the disaster movie your brain is playing, you can focus on the simple emotional fear underneath. When your brain says, "What if this presentation goes terribly and my career is over?" you can translate, "I'm afraid of feeling embarrassed." Then you can ask, "Can I handle feeling embarrassed for a few minutes if that's what happens?" The answer is almost always yes. You've felt embarrassed before and survived it. You can feel embarrassed again if necessary. This translation process deflates anxiety's power because it reveals how manageable the actual fear is. You're not really afraid of career-ending disaster. You're afraid of a temporary emotional experience. And temporary emotional experiences, no matter how unpleasant, are survivable. Let me give you another personal example. I used to have severe anxiety about posting anything online. My brain would create elaborate scenarios. What if people think this is stupid? What if I get criticism? What if I look foolish? What if this ruins my reputation? The catastrophic script made posting feel extremely risky. My brain was presenting social media as a potential career-ending minefield. But when I translated the fear, it became much simpler. I'm afraid of feeling judged. That's it. Not actual consequences, not real damage, just the temporary emotional experience of feeling judged. Could I handle feeling judged for a few minutes? Of course. I'd felt judged before. It was unpleasant but not dangerous. With this understanding, posting became much easier. Not because the possibility of judgment disappeared, but because I stopped treating judgment like a life-threatening emergency. The same translation process works for almost every anxious scenario. Anxious about starting a business? Catastrophic script. What if it fails, and I lose everything, and everyone thinks I'm irresponsible? Translation: I'm afraid of feeling foolish if it doesn't work out. Anxious about a difficult conversation. Catastrophic script. What if they get angry and never speak to me again? Translation: I'm afraid of feeling rejected or criticized. Anxious about making a decision. Catastrophic script. What if I choose wrong and regret it forever? Translation: I'm afraid of feeling regret. In every case, when you strip away the dramatic packaging, you find a simple human fear of temporary emotional discomfort. This doesn't minimize the fear. Emotional discomfort is genuinely unpleasant, but it helps you respond proportionally instead of treating every psychological risk like a mortal threat. Most anxiety dissolves when you realize you're not actually afraid of external events. You're afraid of internal experiences. And internal experiences, however uncomfortable, are temporary and survivable. The goal isn't to eliminate the possibility of feeling bad. The goal is to stop being afraid of feeling bad. When you're no longer afraid of temporary discomfort, anxiety loses its power to control your behavior. You can take action despite the possibility of embarrassment, rejection, or regret because you know those feelings, if they come, will pass. The catastrophic language becomes background noise. You hear it, recognize it as emotional static, and focus on what actually matters, moving forward despite uncertainty. Fear speaks in disasters, but it usually means something much simpler, and simpler fears are much easier to face. Change the story anxiety tells about who you are, and anxiety changes. Every man carries stories about himself. Most of these stories were written years ago by people who didn't know better in circumstances that no longer exist. But they keep running like background software, shaping every decision and filtering every experience. Anxiety is often these old stories trying to protect themselves from new information. I'm not good enough. I'm not the type of person who succeeds. I don't deserve good things. People will reject me if they really know me. These narratives feel true because they've been reinforced by years of selective attention. Your brain looks for evidence that confirms the story and ignores evidence that contradicts it. If your story is, "I'm not capable," you'll notice every mistake and forget every success. If your story is, "People don't like me," you'll remember every awkward interaction and dismiss every positive response. The story becomes self-perpetuating because it shapes how you interpret reality. But here's what most people don't realize. These stories are not facts about you. They're just the current programming running in your head. And like any software, they can be updated. The process isn't about positive thinking or affirmations. It's about consciously examining the code that's running your life and deciding whether it's serving you. Let me show you how this works with a real example. For years, my internal story was, "I'm someone who has good ideas but struggles with execution." This story explained every unfinished project, every abandoned goal, every moment of procrastination. It wasn't serving me, but it was familiar. That story created specific anxieties. Whenever I started something important, anxiety would hit because my brain knew that people like me don't follow through. Starting meant risking confirmation that I was, indeed, someone who couldn't execute. So anxiety would create obstacles, perfectionism, overthinking, distraction, suddenly urgent other priorities. All designed to protect me from proving the story true. The breakthrough came when I realized I could consciously rewrite the story. Instead of, "I'm someone who has good ideas but struggles with execution," I chose, "I'm someone who learns to execute through practice." The new story created different possibilities. Instead of anxiety protecting me from inevitable failure, challenges became opportunities to develop execution skills. Setbacks became data about what to adjust rather than evidence of fundamental inadequacy. The anxiety didn't disappear overnight, but its character changed. Instead of desperate protection of a limiting story, it became information about what skills needed development. Here's the framework for rewriting your own code. Step 1. Identify the current story. Pay attention to how you complete this sentence. I'm the type of person who... Common limiting stories. I'm the type of person who starts things but doesn't finish them. I'm the type of person who gets anxious in social situations. I'm the type of person who isn't good with money. I'm the type of person who doesn't deserve success. Step 2. Examine the evidence. Is this story actually true, or is it a selective interpretation of your experiences? Usually, you'll find the story is maintained by focusing on failures while ignoring successes, interpreting neutral events as negative, using past performance to predict future capability, treating temporary states as permanent traits. Step 3. Choose a more useful story. Craft a narrative that allows for growth instead of confirming limitation. Transform. I'm not good at this. I'm developing skill in this area. I always mess things up. I learn from every attempt. People don't like me. I connect authentically with the right people. I'm not smart enough. I figure out what I need to know. Step 4. Live into the new story. This is the crucial part. You have to act as if the new story is true, even before you fully believe it. If your new story is, I'm someone who follows through on commitments, you start following through on small commitments. If your new story is, I'm someone who handles challenges well, you start approaching challenges as someone who handles them well would. The behavior change comes first. The belief follows. Step 5. Use anxiety as feedback. When anxiety hits, ask, is this old programming trying to protect the limiting story? Often you'll find that anxiety spikes when you're about to act in a way that contradicts your old narrative. The anxiety is trying to keep you consistent with who you used to be. This becomes useful information. Anxiety signals that you're pushing against old limitations instead of retreating. You can recognize this as evidence that you're growing. Let me give you another example. A guy I know had the story, I'm awkward in social situations. This story was reinforced by years of anxiety around meeting new people, speaking up in groups, and initiating conversations. The story created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because he believed he was awkward, he would overthink social interactions, which made him actually awkward, which confirmed the story. He rewrote it to, I'm someone who connects with people authentically. At first, this felt completely false, but he started acting as if it were true. Instead of avoiding social situations, he approached them as someone who connects authentically would. Instead of overthinking every interaction, he focused on being genuinely interested in other people. The behavior change gradually shifted his identity. Social anxiety didn't disappear, but it transformed from, I'm going to be awkward and people will notice, to, I'm learning to connect more, not to rally. The key insight is that your stories about yourself are not discoveries of fixed truth. They're decisions about how to interpret your experience. You can choose stories that expand your possibilities instead of limiting them. You can choose stories that use challenges as growth opportunities instead of evidence of inadequacy. The anxiety that protects old, limiting stories will resist this change, but that resistance becomes a navigation tool. The stronger the anxiety around a new behavior, the more likely that behavior is to expand your sense of what's possible. Rewriting your code isn't about denying reality or pretending to be someone you're not. It's about choosing which aspects of your reality to emphasize and which possibilities to explore. Your old stories served a purpose. They kept you safe from risks and disappointments. But safety isn't the only value worth optimizing for. Growth, contribution, and authentic expression might be worth some risk. The choice is always yours. You can keep running the old code that anxiety protects, or you can consciously install new programming that serves who you want to become. But you can't do both. At some point, you have to decide which story gets to run your life. When anxiety becomes information, productivity becomes inevitable. Here's what nobody tells you about productivity. It's not about time management, efficiency hacks, or motivation. It's about your relationship with your own mind. Most productivity advice assumes you're working with a cooperative brain that wants to help you achieve your goals. But if you struggle with anxiety, your brain often feels like an adversary that creates obstacles every time you try to focus. You sit down to work, and immediately the mental chatter begins. This isn't good enough. You're behind schedule. What if you can't deliver? Maybe you should research this more. Actually, you should check email first, or clean your desk, or you spend more energy fighting your own mind than actually working. By the end of the day, you're exhausted from internal struggle but haven't made meaningful progress. This was my reality for years. I'd sit at my desk for hours, wrestling with anxiety while producing virtually nothing. I tried every productivity system, every focus technique, every app designed to eliminate distraction. None of it worked because I was treating symptoms instead of causes. The breakthrough came when I stopped trying to eliminate anxiety and started using it as information. Instead of fighting the mental chatter when I sat down to work, I would pause and ask, "What is this protecting me from?" Usually the answer was some version of, "I'm afraid this work will prove I'm not as capable as I need to be." Once I identified the identity fear, I could address it directly instead of just pushing through the anxiety. If my brain was afraid the work would reveal incompetence, I'd remind myself, I'm someone who develops competence through practice. This work is practice, regardless of the outcome. If my brain was afraid the work wouldn't be perfect, I'd remind myself, I'm someone who improves through iteration. The goal is progress, not perfection. If my brain was afraid I'd disappoint people with subpar results, I'd remind myself, I'm someone who delivers value while continuing to grow. This is my current best effort, and that's enough. This simple reframe changed everything. Instead of fighting my brain while trying to work, I could acknowledge its concerns and then focus on the task. The anxiety didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling my behavior. I could feel the familiar tension and recognize it as my security system checking for threats, then return my attention to productive action. Let me give you the specific framework that transformed my productivity. Before starting work. 1. Notice what anxiety or resistance comes up. 2. Ask, what identity is this trying to protect? 3. Consciously choose an identity that can handle imperfect results. 4. Set an intention. I'm working as someone who insert chosen identity. During work. 1. When anxiety interrupts, pause without judgment. 2. Ask, what is my brain trying to protect me from right now? 3. Address the concern. I can handle whatever the fear is if it happens. 4. Return attention to the task. After work. 1. Acknowledge what you learned, regardless of results. 2. Note what triggered anxiety and how you handled it. 3. Adjust your approach for next time. This process turns anxiety from an obstacle into a coaching tool. Instead of anxiety derailing your focus, it provides information about what internal adjustments need to be made. For example, if anxiety spikes when you're writing, it might mean your brain is afraid the words won't be good enough. Instead of fighting that fear, you acknowledge it. My brain is trying to protect me from producing mediocre work. I understand the concern. I choose to write as someone who improves through practice. When you're not afraid of making mistakes, you can experiment boldly instead of only attempting guaranteed successes. When you're not afraid of being judged, you can share work early and get feedback instead of polishing in isolation. Anxiety, when understood properly, becomes a productivity tool because it highlights exactly where you need more internal flexibility. The areas where you feel most anxious about working are usually the areas where you have the most rigid expectations of yourself. And rigid expectations are productivity killers because they make everything feel high stakes. By using anxiety as a diagnostic tool, you can identify and upgrade the internal beliefs that create unnecessary pressure. Work becomes more sustainable because you're not constantly trying to prove something about yourself through your performance. Let me share one more example that illustrates this principle. I used to have severe anxiety about any work that involved deadlines. My brain would create elaborate scenarios about missing the deadline, disappointing people, and damaging my reputation. This anxiety was so distracting that I'd often procrastinate until the last minute, then rush through the work in a panic. When I examined what identity the anxiety was protecting, I found I'm someone who delivers on commitments perfectly and on time. This identity was rigid and brittle. It couldn't handle delays, complications, or imperfect results. So any work with deadlines felt like a threat to my identity as someone reliable. I upgraded to, I'm someone who communicates honestly about realistic timelines and delivers the best work possible within constraints. This new identity could handle delays by communicating early, complications by adjusting scope, and imperfect results by being transparent about limitations. The anxiety around deadlines didn't disappear, but it transformed. Instead of paralyzing fear about maintaining a perfect track record, it became useful tension that helped me assess whether I was being realistic about what was possible. I could use that tension to have honest conversations about timelines, ask for help when needed, and focus on delivering value rather than protecting my image as someone who never struggles. Work became more efficient because I wasn't spending energy maintaining an unsustainable identity. And paradoxically, by accepting that I might sometimes miss deadlines or deliver imperfect work, I actually became more reliable because I was working with reality instead of against it. This is the core insight. Productivity isn't about eliminating anxiety. It's about transforming your relationship with anxiety so it becomes information rather than interference. When anxiety tells you something useful about what internal work needs to be done, you can do that work and then focus on external tasks. When anxiety is just protecting outdated stories about who you need to be, you can update those stories and redirect the energy toward productive action. The storm doesn't have to stop for you to work effectively in it. You just need to learn to hear the signal within the noise. What once destroyed you now guides you. There's a moment in every man's transformation when he realizes his greatest weakness has become his greatest strength, not because the weakness disappeared, but because he learned to use it differently. For years, I saw anxiety as evidence that something was wrong with me. I was broken while other people were whole. I was struggling while they were succeeding. I was fighting internal battles while they moved forward effortlessly. I spent enormous energy trying to become someone who didn't experience anxiety. I wanted to be calm, confident, unshakable, like the successful people I admired seemed to be, but that person didn't exist, and trying to become him was keeping me stuck. The transformation began when I stopped trying to eliminate anxiety and started treating it as useful information about my internal state. Every anxious moment became a data point. What identity is being threatened? What story is being protected? What growth edge am I approaching? Instead of anxiety being evidence of weakness, it became evidence of sensitivity, the ability to detect subtle threats to psychological well-being that others might miss. Instead of anxiety being a sign of inadequacy, it became a sign of high standards, caring enough about outcomes to feel concerned when they're uncertain. Instead of anxiety being proof of brokenness, it became proof of a highly active threat detection system that just needed better calibration. This reframe changed everything. Anxiety went from being my greatest liability to being my most reliable, early warning system. Now when anxiety shows up, I don't panic about being anxious. I get curious about what it's detecting. Is it warning me that I'm about to take on too much and set myself up for failure? Is it alerting me that I'm operating from an outdated identity that needs upgrading? Is it signaling that I'm avoiding something important because it feels psychologically risky? Is it telling me that I need to have a difficult conversation I've been postponing? Anxiety became a navigation system. Instead of random suffering, it became directed guidance about what needed attention. But the transformation goes deeper than just using anxiety as information. Over time, I began to see anxiety as a competitive advantage. Most people are controlled by their anxiety without understanding it. They make decisions based on avoiding discomfort rather than pursuing what matters. They stay in their comfort zones because uncertainty feels dangerous. They don't take meaningful risks because their brain screams warnings about all the ways things could go wrong. But when you understand anxiety's language, you can hear the warnings without being paralyzed by them. You can assess whether the threat is real or imaginary, whether the identity being protected is worth protecting, whether the risk is worth taking, despite the discomfort. This gives you a significant advantage. While others are being controlled by anxiety they don't understand, you can use your anxiety as guidance for where to focus growth efforts. While others avoid challenges because they create anxiety, you can approach challenges knowing that anxiety often signals important work. While others interpret anxiety as evidence they shouldn't proceed, you can interpret anxiety as evidence that you're pushing against old limitations. Men who master this transformation develop a kind of anti-fragile confidence. They're not confident because they never feel anxious. They're confident because they know how to interpret and use anxiety effectively. They don't avoid situations that create anxiety. They approach them with curiosity about what they might learn. They don't see anxiety as evidence of inadequacy. They see it as evidence of a sensitive system that helps them navigate complexity. They don't try to be the man who never feels uncertain. They become the man who acts wisely despite uncertainty. This creates a different kind of strength, not the brittle strength of someone trying to appear invulnerable, but the flexible strength of someone who has learned to work with his own psychology instead of against it. Other people notice this difference. There's something compelling about a man who clearly faces his fears rather than pretending he doesn't have them. Something trustworthy about someone who acknowledges difficulty instead of performing effortless confidence. The signal that once warned you away from challenges now guides you toward them. The sensitivity that once felt like weakness now provides insight that others miss. The early warning system that once created paralysis now creates informed action. Your greatest weakness hasn't disappeared. It has been transformed into your most reliable strength. And that transformation changes not just how you work, but how you move through the world. The signal never stops broadcasting. Even now, as you finish this book, your anxiety is providing information about your internal state, your growth edges, your unexamined beliefs. Maybe you're feeling anxiety about whether this approach will actually work for you. Maybe you're worried about the effort required to implement these ideas. Maybe you're concerned about what you might discover or about yourself if you start listening to your anxiety instead of fighting it. That's useful information. The anxiety about change is telling you that transformation threatens some identity that feels important to protect. The worry about effort is signaling that part of you believes significant results should come easily. The concern about self-discovery is highlighting that you might be carrying stories about yourself that you're afraid to examine. All of this is signal. All of it points toward internal work that, if done, will expand your capacity to handle reality as it is rather than requiring it to be different. The signal never stops broadcasting. Even now, as you finish this book, your anxiety is providing information about your internal state, your growth edges, your unexamined beliefs. When you can work with anxiety instead of against it, when you can hear signal instead of being overwhelmed by noise, when you can respond from understanding rather than just reacting from emotion, everything else becomes more possible. Not easier, more possible. The challenges don't disappear. The uncertainty doesn't resolve. The complexity doesn't simplify. But your capacity to navigate all of it expands significantly. And that expanded capacity is what allows you to pursue what actually matters instead of just managing what feels urgent. The signal will keep broadcasting as long as you're alive. The question is whether you'll learn to listen to it or continue being controlled by noise you don't understand. The choice, as always, is yours. But now you know, the storm isn't your enemy. It's been trying to guide you home all along. You just needed to learn its language.